This is Freddie. All right, go ahead, take it away.
Freddie's here to coach me, in case I forget what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a seductive narrative voice. And that's a writer whose style of writing is so entertaining in and of itself. He can lead the reader anywhere. And there are many examples of this. Shakespeare is one, although some people find Shakespeare a little awkward because his word constructions are antiquated. But he coined so many phrases that we use today that we say them without thinking about them, without knowing where they came from, such as parting is such sweet sorrow. But let's move into modern times. There are two extremes to the seductive narrative voice. At one end, you have a writer whose use of the language is so elegant and fanciful that you love to read it just for the music of the words. A lot of these writers require that you have a dictionary at your elbow at all times. One of them is Anthony Burgess, who wrote A Clockwork Orange. Burgess wrote a lot of other books, and most of them are wildly entertaining. I recommend him. Another is Michael Chabon, who's most famous for The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. Chabon also wrote a novel about a record store in Berkeley called Telegraph Avenue. There's a chapter in it that's 3,000 words long. It's about a parrot that escapes from its cage. And it's all one sentence. I've read it, and at no point did I slow down or get bored. Now that's the mark of a gifted writer. And that's what we mean by a seductive narrative voice. Another one of my favorites is Raymond Chandler, who created Philip Marlowe, the archetype of the anti-hero, the archetype of the private detective who down these mean streets must go to protect his honor and the honor of his clients. Chandler coined so many memorable phrases that they rattle around in my head. One of them is, he was about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on angel food. Another one is, from 20 feet away, she looked like $1 million. From 10 feet away, she looked like a woman who was designed to be seen from 20 feet away. At the other end of the extreme is the narrative voice that's invisible. And that means that the writer is so skilled at describing events and putting you in the scene that you never notice his style. You're living the adventure the way he intended. And I think the best modern example of this is Michael Connelly, the crime writer, who's responsible for the Bosch series, Harry Bosch Detective, and the Lincoln Lawyer series, both of which have been turned into TV shows. Both TV shows are superb, and the reason is that each season is based on one of Connelly's novels. And when you base a television series on a novel from a good writer, that series is going to sing in every frame because it's based on a really good book. Bernard Cornwell is a great historical writer. There's a series on Netflix called The Last Kingdom. There's six years worth. It's about the struggle for the control of England in the 9th century. And every line in it is superb. And once again, it's because it's based on Bernard Cornwell's novels. I recommend that too. But let's talk about literature itself. In the style of the seductive narrative voice, I'm going to show you two examples that are about as different from each other as they could be. One is Stephen Hunter. He's a great writer, great thriller writer. He wrote the novel Shooter, which was turned into a movie and then a TV series. His protagonist for most of his books is Bob Lee Swagger, who was a sniper in Vietnam, a legendary sniper. He's loosely based on a real man named Andre Hathcock, Hathcock, who was a real sniper in Vietnam and had a kill count of over 100. But this is about Bob Lee's father, Earls Swagger, whose adventures take place in the post-war period, but this one takes place during World War II. The Bullet Garden is about a grove of wild trees in Europe that the Nazis own through their snipers. They know where to sit, they know where to crouch, and they know where the enemy is coming from. And the Allies can't figure it out, so every time they enter this area, they sustain casualties. But what I'm going to read for you is the language of an English intelligence officer. And you can just hear this guy. This is what I mean by a seductive narrative voice. Dear Roger, listen to the American lieutenant here. Do you think the Americans would have sent a fellow so far as they've sent this one just to tell you lies? This fellow is an actual son of the earth. His pater was a farmer. He raises wheat and cows and fights red Indians as in the movies. He is tall, silent, noble. He is a walking myth. Listen to him. It's because you're all so similar, he said, as if he'd given the matter a great deal of right, proper Oxonian thought. It has to do with gene pools. In our country, or in Europe, on the whole, the gene pool is much more diverse. You see that in the fantastic European faces, really. Go to any city in Europe, and the variety in such features as eye spacing, jawline, height of forehead, width of cheekbones is extraordinary. I could watch it for days. But you Yanks seem to have about 3 faces between you, and you pass them back and forth. Yours is the farm boy face, rather broad, no visible bone structure, pleasant, but not sharp enough to be particularly attractive. I fear you'll lose your hair prematurely. Your people do have good, healthy dentition, I must give you that. But all the plumpness on the face, you must eat nothing but cake. It goes to your face and turns you rather balloonish, and it's bloody hard keeping you apart. You remind me of at least 6 other Americans I know, and I can't remember their names either. Wait, one of them is a chap called Carruthers. Do you know him? And that character has such a distinctive voice, and he's so entertaining when he talks that you're just lapping those words up one by one like a dog following a trail of crumbs through the house. At the other end of the extreme is James Elroy. You may not know who he is, but you've all seen L.A. Confidential. He wrote that novel. He's one of the great American crime writers. I also recommend The Big Nowhere. This is before he turned to novels. This is a short story he wrote. And I have to point out that Elroy was heavily influenced by the scandal rags of the 60s, which were everywhere. There were weekly tabloids which said major Hollywood star caught in love nest, stuff like that people lap up. They're around today, but now it's mostly on the internet. But back then, Elroy ate this stuff up. And having learned from them, he absorbed certain factors, which I'm going to point out. One is the short sentence like a machine gun, and another is the use of alliteration, heavy use of alliteration. Russ Custer ran Hollywood Homicide. He took no shit. He brooked no shit. He brooded over bonded bourbon nightly. He favored Rubens, the Firefly, and the Hilltop Hungarian. Hollywood hemmed him in. He shit where he ate. He kept a condo on Cahuenga. He warred with his wife there. They battled over his bitches in his Walpurgisnachttian workload. I grabbed Russ in the squad room. He checked out my rhino regalia. I love rhinos. I've got a faux rhino gun belt and faux rhino boots. My faux rhino bedspread captivates coos. I fucked a rhino once. A street creep slipped me a hash brownie. I flew Trans Zulu Airways to Zimbabwe. It was so good. Russ said, "You look like a fucking pimp. You may be useful here." Those are 2 examples of modern seductive narrative voice. I don't think that aspiring writers should think about their narrative voice. What you want to do is think about the story and tell the story as entertainingly as you can. And that means you lay your words out to convey what you want to convey. Don't get too wordy, don't get too clever. Remember that adjectives are not your friend. But the story comes first, and when you understand story, and you're not worried about what you write or whether anybody's going to like it, you know you have arrived and that you've got a style.
All right. Well, good. Any other words of wisdom for your audience?
I say this every day. Carry a pad and a pen with you at all times if you're a writer, or even if you're not a writer, but it's especially important for writers. When you get an idea, write it down. When you hear a fascinating name, write it down. When you hear somebody using the English language in an entertaining way you've never heard before, write that down. It's important to write dialogue the way real people talk, so keep your ears open.
All right.
Hi,
Thanks
folks.
so much.
Today we're going to talk about how long a story should be. A lot of beginning writers who want to be novelists or short story writers, they start out and they say, well, how long does a story have to be? And the answer is that a story has to be as long as it's necessary to tell the story. Well, how long is that? Can you aim for certain lengths? What's the sweet target? It depends on what you're trying to write. If we're talking about novels, 60,000 words is considered a small novel. That's not a big deal. I have friends who write 5,000 words a day before noon, come hell or high water. That means if they do it for 12 days, they've got 60,000 words. It's discipline which produces all those words. How long should a short story be? Same answer. As long as it takes to get the point across. The difference between a short story and a novel is that a short story is about only one thing. A number of short stories come to mind, like August Heat, which is a favorite horror short story. I recommend it, about how the heat affects a man wandering through his town during the height of August when he comes across a tombstone maker and finds his own name on the tombstone. There are so many great stories like that, and there are a lot of markets for short stories. If you want to be a professional writer, don't try to do the Olympic jump first time out of the gate. Write short stories. They take less time to write. You can write a bunch of them, and there's a huge market for them. Just go online and look for online magazines searching for short stories, and you'll find more than you can possibly handle. One of my favorites is published by an old friend of mine in Wisconsin. It's called Rosebud, and they take all kinds of short stories. You might want to check that out. When it comes to a novel, people have good ideas, and then they start out, but they often peter out halfway through because they are not experienced and they have not yet come to understand what constitutes story. Once you understand what constitutes story, you don't make a wrong turn and you don't worry about length. Well, what constitutes story? That's the answer to that is a little puzzling, but you'll know it when you got it. There's so many things that go into a novel. The narrative voice, a fascinating character, a fascinating situation, and also specialty knowledge. If you can talk about a scene which does not necessarily advance the plot, but entertains the reader and does not deviate from the plot, that's part of the story. I remember reading a novel many years ago, I can't recall the name, but it involved one of the major characters going into a restaurant and ordering a huge meal. He ordered the salad, the blood pudding, the filet, the noodles, a side dish of steamed vegetables. Then he ate it all. Then he called the waiter over and he said, "Let's do it all again." And that stuck with me all these years because it's memorable and it was funny. It didn't really advance the plot because it was part of the story. It was part of the story because it was what that character would do, and it gives us insight into that character. When I first started writing novels, I had no idea what I was doing. I would just sit down and wing it. I have since concluded that's not a good plan. And now I outline everything before I write it, including graphic novels. There are only a handful of writers who can sit down and wing it without setting out a direction for themselves ahead of time. Peter Branville, the Western writer, is one of them. But Westerns have a certain path that they follow for the most part. And when you write a Western, you're never at a loss for what happens next because we've absorbed the legend of the West, so many of us, from reading novels and watching the movies, that we know what's going to happen next. There are going to be encounters. There might be a shootout. There might be a revenge story mixed in. There might be a survival story mixed in. But the West keeps throwing ideas at you so that you're never out of them. When it comes to other novels, I advise you to outline. Most commercial novels are in the 80 to 90,000 word range. I just finished a novel by Larry Correia called Gun Runner. It was 150,000 words. I'm going to be turning that into 2 graphic novels of 90 pages each. It's an enormous undertaking. But when it comes to length, the king of the long-witted novelists is James Michener, who's written so many memorable books. His longest book is Texas, which is 400,000 words long. About 10 years ago, I began reading his novel Centennial, which is about Colorado. In fact, it's placed where I live. It's placed right around here, and Greeley features prominently as the town of Centennial. I read, it begins with the dinosaurs. That's what Michener does. He begins in a prehistoric time and then takes us up through everything. And by the time I got through the settling of the West, the novel took a blander turn for me, and I wasn't that interested, so I set it down. I have not yet finished it. But when people say, what are you reading? I always answer, James Michener's Centennial, day 3,415. Centennial's 232,000 words. I recently picked this up because it's so emblematic of what we're talking about. This has got to be at least 250,000 words. I will get to it one of these days. So that's my advice. Start out with a short story. You can write the premise out in 1 or 2 sentences. Finish it. Submit it. If they send it back, keep submitting it. There's no greater confidence builder than selling your first short story. When it comes to novels, outline. Interest yourself. I always say a writer has to entertain himself before he can entertain readers. So keep that in mind. When you're writing, do you find what you write entertaining? And that's not the same as do you find what you're writing good, because a lot of people kid themselves into thinking what they just wrote is good because they wrote it. But that's not the final arbiter. You have to write for a long time before you understand what constitutes story. I've mentioned this before, but there's a great English novelist named John Braine, whose most famous book was Room at the Top. And he wrote a book about writing, of which there are many. And he wrote that it's called Writing Your Novel. And in it he says, no one should attempt to write a novel before they're 40 years old because they simply don't have enough worldly experience to be able to describe the world from all points of view. And it's the novelist's job to imagine every point of view presented in his novel. That's it. Get writing.
Thank you.
Hey, folks. I'm going to talk about the role of a comic creator today. Comic books are probably the most transparent multi-medium you can use to communicate. They look so simple. Everybody thinks they can do a comic, and everybody does. But as in every other field of the arts or expression, they run the gamut from unreadable to brilliant. You want to tend toward the brilliant side. Well, how do you do that? Well, one way is to have a gripping, compelling, emotionally satisfying story that will stick with the reader, but that's up to the individual writer. Right now, I want to talk about the technique of writing and why it's important for the writer to provide visual direction and all the dialogue up front. You provide the visual direction because you can see it in your mind. This is not to usurp the part of the artist. I've worked with many artists who say, I saw what you wrote and I want to try it this way. And if it makes sense, I'm happy to do that. So it's not a hard and fast rule. But generally, If you see it in your head, you want to provide the art direction to the artist, and I often do, especially when there's an action sequence. You can't leave the action sequence up to the artist unless the artist is really skilled at showing the action in a logical manner that unfolds in an exciting and dynamic way. I'm speaking specifically of fight choreography. You know, I've picked up a lot of comics that had Kung Fu in the title, and none of them had any Kung Fu. It was just a selling point with writers who are not familiar with the martial arts. That's why I strive to show martial art techniques that are realistic and compelling and dynamic and unfold in front of the reader in a logical manner. And one way to do that, and one of the most important ways, and this is the way they do it in films, is you hold your camera steady and let the figures do the moving. You want to know what I mean? Just look at any Donnie Yen film, especially the Ip Man movies. Nobody wants to see an extreme close-up of a fist slugging a chin. Nobody wants to see that. It doesn't advance the story. It's not visually interesting. They want to see the technique unfold. Now, if it's a simple punch, you can break that up into as many panels as you want. It really doesn't require a lot of panels, but there's the preparation and then there's the follow through. You hold your camera at mid-range distance so you can see the characters. You don't shift around. The person on the left stays on the left. The person on the right stays on the right. You know, we always talk about the Marvel method, and that was when Stan Lee would write a short description of the book, and it was probably no more than 1 page. Then he'd pass it off to Jack and say, "Here, Jack, you figure it out," thereby delegating all responsibility for art direction to Jack Kirby. Fortunately, Jack Kirby was a genius, but all artists aren't geniuses. So you have to tell them what they're looking at. And it's okay to ape a screenplay, mid-range, far range, and especially left to right. I like to show action unfold from left to right because that's the way people read. But occasionally it unfolds from right to left, and that's okay too. It's important also to include all dialogue. You do this so that the artist knows how his character is acting. Who is the actor that is reciting these words? An actor who says, "That's it, we're all going to die," is not going to have the same expression as an actor who says, "Oh, what a wonderful day." The artist has to know the mood, the scene, and the dialogue to get the characters right. I will often provide casting suggestions for characters I create right off the top of my head, like, this guy should look like Ernest Borgnine. These are not hard and fast. I don't expect the artist to look up Ernest Borgnine and copy his pictures literally, but I want him to be aware of the type of character I'm looking for. And in the case of Ernest Borgnine, it's a stocky, well-muscled, somewhat dour individual of middle years. As you know, for many years I wrote comics by drawing each page out by hand. I no longer do that. I write full scripts, but everybody's happy with my full scripts because they don't go on and on. They're terse, they're to the point, and I provide all the dialogue. And I've said this before, I'm just going to throw it in again, but every time I read anything I've written, I find a way to improve it by taking words out. And that's it.
Yeah. And just a little for the audience, so Mike has a good idea of like a karate or martial arts moves because you are, what, fourth degree black belt in karate, is that right?
That's true.
Okay, so from personal experience. All right, any words of wisdom to leave with your audience?
The hat, folks. Always take a hat.
Yeah. Okay, the next one we're going to wear a little bit more stylish hat, but that's all right. It's cold here.
Good morning, folks. This morning, we're gonna talk about how to make a comic. Comics appear to be one of the most transparent mediums you've ever seen. They're just pictures on paper with words. Everybody thinks they can do a comic, and everybody does. But like any other medium, comics are what you make of them. They can stretch from the ridiculous to the sublime. It depends on the creator, and the creator is often the writer. It can often be the artist. Sometimes they're the same people. They're words and pictures working together. When I first started writing comics, I wrote comics for 25 years by drawing each page out by hand. Now, as you can see, I am not a great artist, but I'm good enough that anybody can tell what it is that I'm drawing at a glance. I also put in all the dialogue, all the directions, and all the captions you would need. It taught me an invaluable lesson. And that lesson is, how much weight can a page bear? Because we've all seen comics that have too many words. And really this morning's instruction is about how many words you should put into a comic, and to boil it down to its essence, as few as possible. The more words you put in a comic, the more you make it difficult to read. It's a nameless comic from the past, and this isn't even one of the worst examples, but when you look at these 2 pages and the preponderance of captions, the boxes all over, and all these words are kind of crowding out the art, which may or may not be good. In this case, it's very good. It's not great, but it's very good. When you see these words, a little part of your mind unconsciously sighs and says, oh man, I got to hack my way through all these words to follow the story. Comics are a visual medium. And the second most important rule is to show, don't tell. The first, of course, is to entertain. That sounds simple, but apparently it's not. When I say show, don't tell, that means any information you can impart to the reader visually without words, you should. Save your words for characterization and sometimes for advancing the plot. It's inevitable that the dialogue will advance the plot. You want to keep that down to as little as possible. Here's another example. We're inured to all these captions all over the page. This one isn't as bad as some. It's worse than others. The thing is that a lot of those captions are telling you what you can already see. More often, you get captions that are bringing you up to speed and then contain an internal dialogue by the protagonist saying, 45 years ago, werewolves kidnapped my sister, and here I am searching through the land of Oz to find her. I will do anything to find her. That's telling. It's not showing. It's a very simple test. Are you telling the audience what they need to know, or are you showing the audience what they need to know? You can say, John was a mean son of a bitch, or you can show John crossing the street to kick a stray dog. Which one is more powerful? When I start a comic, I have 500 words in a bag. Each one of those words is a gold coin. And when I spend the 501st coin, all those coins turn to stainless steel. When I spend the 601st coin, they all turn to lead. The point is, tell your story with as few words as possible. That doesn't mean it should be wordless. I don't like wordless comics. You breeze through them in 30 seconds, and then you forget them afterwards. You say, yeah, the art was beautiful, but there was no story. And because without words, there is no story. It's the words in context that make a story come alive. And that's one reason why 70 years after The Wizard of Oz was released, people are saying, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Now, I warn you, if you ever find yourself writing that in a comic, stop immediately, push it away, and rethink your life. When you have your characters speak, they should sound like real people do. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can say the dialogue out loud. Say it to your wife. Say, does that sound natural? Say it to your friends. Does that sound natural? But the words in context when they work, have an indelible impression. And the proof is that we're still saying, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, we're still saying, face it, Tiger, you just won the jackpot, or it's clobbering time, because the first time they appeared in context, it worked. And those words, because they stay with us, they're always rattling around in the back of our heads. There's a great temptation to use them, but don't. Be original. That's the third rule of entertainment. 1, entertain. 2, show, don't tell. 3, be original.